They didn't break him because he was weak. They broke him because he refused to look away. Before we continue, picture a town so quiet you could hear a screen door creak from 50 yards out, a place where dust settled slow and people minded their own business, until the wrong kind of kindness showed up. The sun hung high over Dry Creek that afternoon, the kind of dry heat that made the air shimmer and the boards of every building crack just a little louder than usual. And right there in the middle of Main Street stood Elias Whitmore, a man past 70, shoulders bent from years behind a plow, holding a tin cup in his shaking hand as if it weighed more than iron, and across from him, just 10 feet away, a boy stood barefoot in the dirt, no older than 10, his skin sun-browned, his clothes torn from travel, his eyes sharp in a way no child should be, watching everything at once and trusting nothing, and between them, nothing but silence and the weight of a town that had already decided what was right and what was not. Elias didn't speak at first, didn't rush, didn't even look around to see who might be watching, because men like him had learned long ago that doing the right thing often meant doing it alone, and slowly, like it was the most natural thing in the world, he stepped forward and held out the cup, water catching the sunlight in a small trembling ripple, and the boy hesitated, not out of fear of the man, but out of fear of what that simple gesture might cost them both, because out here, kindness had a price, and everyone knew it, even a child. Boots shifted behind them, leather creaked, a chair scraped across wood somewhere along the saloon porch, and the air changed, not louder, not faster, just heavier, like something unseen had decided to step into the moment and stay there. And still Elias didn't pull his hand back, didn't flinch, didn't lower his gaze. He just stood there, patient, steady, offering water like it was no more dangerous than breathing. "A child ain't your enemy," he said finally, voice low, rough like dry timber, not aimed at the boy, not even aimed at the men gathering behind him, but spoken into the dust itself, like a truth that had been waiting too long to be said out loud. And for a second, just 1 second, the whole street seemed to hold its breath, as if the world itself was deciding what to do with that sentence. The boy stepped forward then, slow, careful, eyes flicking past Elias toward the shapes forming behind him, and took the cup with both hands, like it was something sacred, something fragile, something that might vanish if held too loosely. And when he drank, it wasn't quick or desperate. It was measured, deliberate, like he understood this moment would be remembered long after the thirst was gone. A shadow stretched across them both, long and sharp, cutting through the sunlight like a line drawn in the dirt, and Elias finally looked up, meeting the eyes of Sheriff Cole Danner, a man whose badge shined brighter than his patience, whose smile never reached his eyes, and whose presence carried the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. And behind him, 3 other men stood just far enough apart to make it clear this wasn't a conversation anymore. This was a judgment already decided. No one spoke. Not the shopkeeper watching from behind his window, not the woman clutching her shawl by the well, not the boy, not even the sheriff at first, because sometimes silence says more than any words ever could. And in that silence, something shifted, something permanent, something that would not be undone by time or distance or regret. Elias didn't step back. He didn't lower his head. He didn't take the cup away. He just stood there beside the boy, not shielding him with force, not raising a hand, just staying, just choosing not to move. And out there, under that unforgiving sun, in a town that had long forgotten the cost of doing right, that quiet refusal became the loudest thing anyone had heard in years. The sheriff did not raise his voice, and that was how men like him held power, not with noise but with the certainty that everyone else would fall quiet first. And as Cole Danner stepped closer, the boards beneath his boots gave a slow, deliberate creak that echoed farther than it should have, like the town itself was leaning in to listen, and Elias Whitmore could feel the shift without turning his head, could feel eyes pulling away, doors closing. Halfway, conversations dying before they began, because Dry Creek had learned long ago that survival meant choosing when not to see, and today, it had chosen again. The boy lowered the tin cup slowly, both hands still wrapped around it, as if returning it too quickly might undo something that had already taken courage to begin. And when his eyes met Elias again, there was something there now that had not been there before, not just gratitude, not just fear, but recognition, the kind that does not come from knowing a name, but from understanding a choice. And Elias gave the smallest nod, almost nothing, just enough to say that what had been done would not be taken back. You know what you are doing? Danner asked, not angry, not loud, just certain, like a man pointing out the obvious, and Elias did not answer right away, because men like him did not waste words on questions that were not really questions, and instead he reached out, took the empty cup from the boy, and turned it in his hand, watching the water cling to the metal before sliding away in thin, shining lines that caught the sun and disappeared just as quickly. And then he set it down on the edge of the well like it belonged. There, like nothing about this moment was out of place. The boy shifted his weight, dust rising faint around his bare feet, and from somewhere inside his torn shirt, something slipped loose and dropped into the dirt with a soft, almost unnoticed sound. A small leather pouch no bigger than a man's palm, tied with a thin cord darkened by time and use, and neither the sheriff nor the men behind him saw it, because their attention was fixed on Elias, on the old man who had chosen the wrong side of an invisible line. But Elias saw it, of course he did, because he had spent a lifetime noticing the things that others missed, the small details that told the real story beneath the noise. He bent, slow and careful, as if his age alone explained the movement, and picked up the pouch, brushing the dust from it with his thumb, feeling the weight inside, not heavy, but not empty either, something carried, something kept, and without looking at it too closely, without asking what it meant, he slipped it into the inside pocket of his worn coat, the motion so natural it might have gone unseen if anyone had been looking for it. But no one was, because no one was expecting a quiet man to make a choice that would outlast the moment. You ought to remember where you are, Danner said, a little closer now, his shadow falling across both Elias and the boy, stretching long in the afternoon light. And still Elias did not step back, did not turn away. He only rested one hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, not holding him, not forcing him to stay, just there, a presence, a line drawn without words, and the boy stilled under that touch, like something inside him had decided to trust it, just this once. A breeze moved through the street, lifting a thin veil of dust that drifted between them all, softening edges, blurring distance, and in that quiet haze, Elias finally spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just steady. This is still a town, last I checked. And the words settled into the air with a weight that did not need explaining, because everyone there understood what he meant, even if they would not admit it. And for a moment, the kind that stretches longer than it should, no one moved. No one spoke, and the world seemed to wait, balanced on something small and fragile, something that could break without a sound. And in that waiting, the boy took one step back, then another, eyes never leaving Elias, memorizing him, not his face, not his clothes, but the way he stood, the way he did not bend. And then he turned and walked toward the edge of town, slow at first, then faster, until the dust swallowed him whole and left nothing behind but footprints that would fade before sunset. And Elias watched until there was nothing left to see, his hand still resting where the boy had been, as if the space itself held meaning, and only then did he lower it. Only then did he turn slightly toward the men behind him, not in challenge, not in fear, just in acknowledgement, because what had needed to be done was already done, and whatever came next would not change that. No one in Dry Creek spoke his name for the rest of that afternoon, not out loud, not where it could be heard, because silence, out here, had always been the safer language. And as the sun began its slow drop toward the western ridge, the town returned to its routines the way a man returns to a habit he knows is wrong, but cannot seem to break. Doors reopened, boots moved again, voices came back in low, careful tones, but something had shifted beneath it all, something small and stubborn that would not settle back into place. And every glance that passed over Elias Whitmore carried it, that quiet question no one dared to ask. Why him? And why now? He did not linger in the street, did not look for approval or apology, because men like him had long ago learned that neither would come, and instead he walked the quarter-mile back to his land at the edge of town, past the split-rail fence that leaned a little more each year, past the wind pump that groaned with every turn, past the small patch of dry soil he still called a field even though it had not given him much in seasons. And as he moved, the leather pouch rested against his chest, Beneath his coat, a steady, unfamiliar weight that did not belong to him and yet felt like something he had been meant to carry all along. His cabin sat low against the horizon, boards sun-bleached and worn, a place built for function rather than comfort. And when he stepped inside, the air held the faint scent of dust and old wood, the kind that never really leaves. And he set his hat down on the table with the same care he had shown in the street, slow, deliberate, as if every movement deserved its own time. And then he reached into his coat and brought out the pouch, turning it over in his hands under the dim light that slipped through the window. It was simple, stitched by hand, the leather softened by years of use, the cord tied in a way that spoke of habit rather than decoration. And when he loosened it, just enough to look, he found not gold, not coin, not anything a man in town would have called valuable, but a small measure of dark earth mixed with fine ash. And something about it made him pause, not because he understood it, but because he knew he did not need to. Some things did not ask to be explained, only respected, and so he closed the pouch again and set it gently on the table, as if it might hear him if he treated it carelessly. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the dry whisper of grass and the distant creak of wood from town, and with it came the feeling that the day had not ended where it should have, that something had been set in motion that would not stop simply because the sun went down. And Elias stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the edge of the table, eyes on that small piece of leather, and he knew, in the quiet way a man knows the weather is about to turn, that what had happened in the street was not finished, not even close. Back in Dry Creek, Sheriff Cole Danner remained where he had been left, boots planted in the dust, eyes narrowed not in anger but in calculation, because men like him did not react, they adjusted. And as the last of the townsfolk drifted away, he spoke low to the men beside him, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but clear enough that they understood, and whatever he said did not carry the heat of the moment. It carried something colder, something patient, the kind of decision that does not need to be rushed because it knows it will be carried out in full. That evening, as lanterns lit one by one across the town, there were no raised voices, no open confrontations, no signs of what had been decided. And that was how it always began, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with quiet choices made behind closed doors, choices that would shape what came next long before anyone saw the result. Out on his land, Elias stepped back outside, the sky stretching wide and empty above him, stars just beginning to show through the fading light, and he looked toward the direction the boy had gone, though there was nothing left to see, only distance and the promise of miles. And he reached into his coat again, feeling the pouch there, close to his heart, and for the first time since the afternoon, he allowed himself a single thought, not spoken, not even fully formed, just a feeling that settled deep and stayed. Whatever that boy carried with him when he left, it had not been taken, it had been trusted, and that kind of trust, once given, does not disappear, it waits, it grows, and one day, whether a man is ready or not, it comes back. The night did not bring peace to Dry Creek. It only made the silence heavier, the kind that presses against a man's chest when he knows something has already been decided without him. And out beyond the last fence line, where Elias Whitmore's land met the open stretch of scrub and stone, the wind carried a different sound than usual, not louder, not sharper, just wrong in a way that only a man who has lived long enough can recognize. And he stood in the doorway of his cabin with one hand resting on the frame, listening, not for danger, not for trouble, but for confirmation of what his bones were already telling him. The lantern behind him flickered low, casting long shadows across the dirt floor, and inside, the small leather pouch remained on the table, untouched since he had set it down, as if it understood that this night did not belong to it yet, that its meaning would come later, when the world had shifted enough to make sense of it. And Elias glanced back at it once, not with doubt, not with fear, but with the quiet understanding that whatever followed would not be about that object alone, it would be about what it represented, and he had already accepted that when he chose not to look away in the street. From the ridge a half-mile out, 3 figures watched the faint glow of his lantern, still as fence posts, their shapes barely breaking the horizon, and they did not move for a long time, not because they were unsure, but because men who carry out decisions like this do not rush. They wait until the moment settles, until the town forgets just enough, until the quiet feels safe again, and only then do they step forward, one at a time, measured, deliberate, leaving no sound but the soft crunch of dry earth under worn boots. Back in town, Sheriff Cole Danner sat alone in his office, hat resting on the corner of his desk, a glass untouched beside it, and he stared at nothing in particular, because he did not need to see anything to understand what was happening. He had set it in motion hours ago, not with anger, not with raised voice, but with a single instruction spoken low and clear, and now it would carry itself forward, as these things always did, without him needing to be present, without him needing to explain, and that was how authority worked in places like this. It moved through others, quietly, efficiently, leaving no trace that could be pointed to when the morning came. Elias stepped out onto the dry ground, boots settling into familiar grooves, and the sky above him stretched wide and black, stars sharp and cold, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe in the night air, steady and slow, as if anchoring himself to something that could not be taken from him, not land, not cattle, not even the fragile peace he had built over the years, but something deeper, something quieter, something that had brought him to that moment in the street and would carry him through whatever came next. And he did not reach for a weapon, did not call out, did not even turn toward the ridge, because he already knew they were there. The wind shifted again, brushing past him with a faint whisper, and in it came the sound of movement, careful, controlled, the kind of approach that does not want to be heard, but does not fear being seen either. And Elias remained where he was, one hand resting at his side, the other loosely at his hip, not tense, not ready, just present, because some things are not met with force, they are met with stillness, and that stillness, more than anything, unsettles the men who expect resistance. The figures drew closer, stopping just outside the reach of his lantern light, and for a moment, they said nothing, and neither did he, because there was nothing to say that had not already been decided hours before, and in that quiet standoff, the kind that does not need words to carry weight, the distance between them felt larger than the land itself, filled with everything the town had chosen to ignore, everything it had buried under routine and habit, and everything that had come to the surface the moment one old man refused to step aside. Elias finally spoke, not loud, not sharp, just enough to carry through the night. "Air, you do what you came for," and the words did not challenge, did not invite. They simply acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement there was something the men had not expected, not fear, not anger, but acceptance, the kind that strips a moment of its power before it can fully take hold. And for a brief second, the wind seemed to pause again, as if even the night itself was waiting to see what would come of a man who refused to be anything other than what he had already chosen to be. The men did not answer him, not right away, because something in his voice had taken the edge off the moment, not enough to stop it, but enough to make it feel different than they had expected, and one of them shifted his weight, boots pressing deeper into the dry ground, as if unsure whether to step forward or stand still, and in that hesitation, the night stretched longer than it should have, filled with the quiet weight of a choice that had already been made, but now felt harder to carry out. Elias Whitmore did not move, did not reach for anything, did not even turn his head to follow their positions, because he understood something they did not, that what they had come to do could not take from him what mattered, not the part that had stood in the street, not the part that had refused to bend, and that understanding settled into the air between them like a truth no one could quite name. One of the men finally stepped closer, stopping just at the edge of the lantern light, his face still hidden, his voice low when he spoke. "You should have stayed out of it," and the words sounded rehearsed, like something told to him rather than something he believed, and Elias gave the smallest nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because he had heard that sentence before in different forms, across different years, always spoken by men who thought staying out of something was the same as being right. "Maybe," Elias said, his voice steady, almost quiet enough to disappear into the wind, "but then it would not be me standing here." And that was all. No speech, no explanation, just a simple line drawn where it had always been, and for a second, the man in front of him seemed to falter, just a flicker, just enough to show that even now, even here, something inside him recognized the weight of that answer. The wind moved again, carrying dust across the ground in thin, shifting lines, and somewhere in the distance a loose board knocked softly against wood, a small, ordinary sound that felt out of place in a moment that had grown too heavy for ordinary things. And Elias turned slightly, not away, not toward, just enough to step back toward the doorway of his cabin, as if giving the night room to pass through without resistance. And the gesture did not challenge them, did not provoke, it simply refused to meet them on the terms they had brought with them. Another man spoke then, sharper this time, though still controlled. This town has rules, and Elias paused at the threshold, one hand brushing the doorframe again, the same place he had rested it before, and he looked out over the land instead of at them, over the stretch of dry grass and fence lines that had outlasted more than one set of rules, more than one man who thought he could decide what belonged and what did not. And he let the silence sit for a moment before answering. So does the land. And that was all, nothing more added, nothing explained, just a quiet reminder that some things existed long before the town had named itself, and would remain long after it was gone. The men did not step closer after that, not immediately, because something had shifted again, not in their orders, not in what they had been told to do, but in how it now felt to carry it out, and one of them glanced back toward the ridge, as if expecting something else, some sign that would make this simpler. But there was none, only the same wide night, the same steady wind, the same old man standing exactly where he had chosen to stand. Elias stepped inside then, slow and unhurried, leaving the door open behind him, the lantern casting its light outward instead of pulling it in, and for a moment, the men remained where they were, just outside that circle of light, as if crossing into it would mean stepping into something they had not come prepared to face, not resistance, not force, but something quieter, something harder to push against. And in that pause, the weight of the night settled fully over them all, pressing down in a way that made even simple movement feel like a decision rather than a reflex. Inside, Elias reached for the table, his fingers brushing the leather pouch once more, not to take it, not to hide it, just to feel its presence. And then he let his hand fall away, because whatever this night was meant to change, it would not change that. And outside, the men finally began to step back, not retreating, not abandoning what they had come to do, but adjusting, the way men do when the path they expected no longer feels as straight as it once did. And as they moved, their shapes fading again into the darkness beyond the lantern's reach, the night seemed to exhale, just slightly, as if something had been delayed, not ended, not avoided, but pushed forward to a moment that had not yet arrived, a moment that would carry more weight than this one. And Elias, standing in the quiet of his cabin, already knew it. Time did not move quickly in Dry Creek. It stretched, it settled, it wore things down the way wind wears down stone, slow enough that no one noticed the change until it had already happened. And in the years that followed that night, the town learned to live around what it had chosen, not by speaking of it, but by letting it sink into the ground like everything else it preferred to forget. And Elias Whitmore became part of that silence, a man who still walked the same fence line every morning, still drew water from the same well, still mended what little he had with hands that grew thinner but never unsteady. And if anyone saw him in town, which was less often with each passing year, they nodded just enough to be polite, never enough to acknowledge what had once stood between them. The leather pouch remained with him always, not displayed, not explained, just carried in the inside pocket of his coat like a quiet promise he had never spoken aloud. And sometimes, on evenings when the sky burned low and red over the horizon, he would take it out and turn it in his hands the same way he had that first night, not opening it, not needing to, because whatever it held had already done its work. It had changed the direction of a moment, and moments like that do not fade, they wait. The land did not grow kinder with age. Seasons came and went with little mercy, dry years stretching longer than good ones, and Elias lost more than he gained. A fence line here, a section of crop there, a mule that did not make it through winter, but he never left, not because he could not, but because leaving would have meant admitting that something had been taken from him, and that was one thing he had never allowed. Not that day, not that night, not ever. In town, Sheriff Cole Danner grew older in a different way. His authority remained. His badge still caught the light. But there was something beneath it now, something that did not sit as steady as it once had. And though no one spoke of it, there were moments, small and fleeting, when he would pause mid-step, glance toward the edge of town, as if remembering something he could not quite place, something unfinished, something waiting. New faces came through Dry Creek, as they always did, drifters, traders, men looking for opportunity or running from something behind them, and they learned the rules the same way everyone else had, not through words, but through what was not said, through the spaces people avoided, through the way certain topics never made it past a half sentence. And among those unspoken things was the memory of a boy who had walked out of town one afternoon and never returned, at least not yet. 12 years passed like that, not quickly, not slowly, just steadily, and Elias Whitmore grew older in the way the land grows older, not weaker, not softer, just quieter, more settled into himself. And on one particular morning, with the sun just beginning to rise over the ridge and the air still holding the cool of night, he stood by his fence line, hands resting on the worn wood, looking out over the same stretch of earth he had looked at for decades, when something changed, not in the land, not in the sky, but in the distance, a faint line along the horizon where there had been nothing the day before. At first, it was only movement, a shift in the light, something too far to name. And Elias did not react, did not call out, did not even straighten his posture, because he had learned long ago that the horizon tells its story slowly, and a man who rushes to read it often gets it wrong. And so he stood there, watching, as the line grew darker, thicker, taking shape not all at once, but piece by piece, until it became something unmistakable, a gathering, not of one or two riders, but many, moving together with purpose, their approach steady, unhurried, like they were not searching for the town, but returning to it. The wind carried a different sound now, low and distant, the kind that settles into the ground before it reaches the ear, and Elias reached into his coat without thinking, fingers finding the leather pouch exactly where it had always been, and for the first time in years, he opened it, just enough to see the dark earth and ash inside, and he closed it again just as quickly, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because some things do not need to be seen twice to be understood, and as he lifted his eyes back to the horizon, watching that distant line grow clearer with every passing moment, he knew, with the same quiet certainty he had felt all those years ago, that what had been set in motion had finally found its way back. By the time the riders reached the outer edge of Dry Creek, the town had already felt them coming, not through sound alone, but through something deeper, something that moved ahead of them like a shadow stretching across the land. And men who had spent their lives reading weather and trouble alike began to step out onto porches and into doorways, narrowing their eyes toward the horizon as if trying to convince themselves it was nothing more than dust and distance. But dust does not move with purpose, and distance does not close itself in a straight line. The first figures came into view just past the old water tower, their shapes dark against the morning light, horses steady, heads low, not rushing, not hesitating, and behind them, more followed, then more again, until the line that had once been a blur resolved into something undeniable, a formation, not scattered, not uncertain, but ordered in a way that carried intention without needing to show it. And the air in Dry Creek shifted once more, just as it had years ago, only now it felt heavier, older, like something long delayed had finally arrived. Sheriff Cole Danner stepped out of his office with his hat already in place, his movements slower than they had once been, but no less deliberate, and he stood in the middle of the street, boots planted in the same dust where another moment had once been decided, and for a brief second, just long enough to be noticed by no one but himself, his hand hovered near his side, as if searching for something that was not there, not a weapon, not a solution, just a certainty he had once carried without question and now could not quite find. The townspeople gathered behind him in small clusters, no one speaking, no one asking, because the answer was already unfolding in front of them, rider after rider entering the town in silence, their presence filling the street not with noise but with weight, and among them, at the very front, rode a man whose posture carried neither pride nor threat, only purpose, his eyes steady as they moved across the buildings, the people, the spaces where memory lingers longer than it should. Elias Whitmore did not wait for them to reach him, did not retreat into his cabin or stand hidden behind his fence, because hiding had never been the choice he made. And so he walked the short distance from his land to the edge of town, each step measured, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. And when he stopped, it was not far from where he had once stood with a tin cup in his hand, the same stretch of ground, the same line drawn between what is easy and what is right. The riders slowed as they approached, not because they were unsure, but because they recognized the place, not the buildings, not the people, but the moment that had begun there years before. And the man at the front raised his hand slightly, just enough for the others to follow, and one by one, the horses came to a stop, hooves settling into the dust without a sound that carried, as if even the ground understood what this was. No one spoke, not the sheriff, not the townspeople, not even the riders, because words, in a moment like this, would only reduce what had taken years to return. And the man at the front dismounted slowly, his boots touching the ground with the same calm certainty he had carried into town, and he stood there for a moment, looking at Elias, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as something recognized, something remembered. And though time had changed them both, though years had added lines and taken strength, there was no hesitation in that gaze, no doubt, only the quiet confirmation of a promise that had never been spoken but had never been forgotten either. Elias reached into his coat then, not quickly, not dramatically, just as he had done 1,000 times before, and his fingers found the leather pouch, worn now from years of being carried, its edges softened, its presence familiar, and he held it there for a moment, not yet bringing it out, because he understood something the others did not, that what stood between them was not a debt, not a threat, but a choice that had come full circle. And as the wind moved lightly through the street, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed wood, the space between the two men seemed to narrow, not in distance, but in meaning, until there was nothing left but the quiet truth of what had been given, what had been carried, and what had now returned. The man who had once been a boy did not rush forward, did not raise his voice, did not look to the sheriff or the crowd for acknowledgement, because this moment did not belong to them. It belonged to something older, something carried quietly across years and miles. And as he took a single step closer to Elias Whitmore, the dust beneath his boots settled without protest, as if even the ground recognized him. And for a long breath, neither of them spoke, because some meetings are not meant to begin with words, they are meant to begin with recognition. The man's face bore the marks of time, not in hardship alone, but in responsibility, in decisions made and carried. And though he stood now as a leader among many, there was something unchanged in his eyes, something that reached back across 12 years to a moment defined not by fear, but by a single act that had not been forgotten. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, low, carrying just enough to be heard without breaking the quiet that had settled over the town. "You kept it," he said, not asking, not doubting, simply stating what he already knew. Elias nodded once, the movement small, deliberate, and then he reached into his coat and brought out the leather pouch, holding it not like an object, but like something that had weight beyond its size. And for a second, the sunlight caught along its worn edges, revealing the years it had spent carried close, unseen, unchanged, and he extended it forward, not as a return of property, but as the closing of something that had never required words. The man did not take it immediately. Instead, he looked at Elias, really looked at him, as if measuring not the years that had passed, but the distance that had not changed. And then, slowly, he stepped closer and accepted the pouch with both hands, the same way he had once accepted a cup of water, careful, deliberate, as if the act itself mattered as much as what was being held. And in that mirrored motion, the past and present aligned without needing explanation. Behind him, the riders remained still, their presence filling the street without pressing into it. Not a show of force, not a threat, but something else entirely, something that the town could not easily name. And Sheriff Cole Danner stood where he had been, watching, waiting for something that did not come. No raised weapons, no demands, no reckoning in the way he had once understood it. Only silence and the steady exchange of something he could not control. The man turned the pouch in his hands briefly, feeling its shape, its contents, and then he looked back at Elias and said, "My name is Takoda." And though the name meant nothing to most of those gathered, it settled into the air with a quiet weight, because it was not just a name, It was the return of something unfinished, something that had left this town as a boy and now stood before it as something more, something shaped not by what had been taken from him, but by what had been given. Elias did not answer with his own name, did not need to, because that part had never been the point, and instead, he simply said, "I remember." And that was all. 2 words that carried 12 years of silence, 12 years of waiting, and the understanding that memory, when held with care, does not fade, it sharpens. Dakota inclined his head slightly, not in submission, not in ceremony, but in respect, the kind that does not need to be announced. And then, without turning to the sheriff, without acknowledging the crowd, he took a step back, and in that movement, something shifted again, not in the riders, not in Elias, but in the town itself, because the moment everyone had expected, the one shaped by fear and assumption, had not arrived. And in its place stood something quieter, something harder to face. The realization that what had returned was not revenge, but remembrance. The wind moved through the street once more, lifting dust in soft spirals that caught the light and drifted between them all, and Dakota closed his hand around the pouch, holding it close for a brief second before securing it again, not as a reclaiming, but as a continuation, and then he looked once more at Elias, the same steady gaze, the same unspoken understanding, and said, "You gave me water when no one else would." And there was no accusation in it, no weight placed on the town, no demand for balance, only the simple truth of what had been, and in that truth, something settled that no one could argue with, because it did not seek agreement, it simply existed. Elias held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod, and neither man smiled. Neither man moved to close the distance further, because what had needed to be done had already been done, and what remained did not belong to them. It belonged to those watching, those listening, those who had once stood silent and now found themselves facing a silence of a different kind, one that did not protect, but revealed. No one moved when the words settled into the air, not because they did not understand them, but because they understood them too well, and in that understanding came something heavier than fear, something quieter than anger, something that had no place to hide. In the town of Dry Creek, which had once relied on silence to protect itself, now found that same silence offering no shelter at all. Sheriff Coldanner stood in the middle of the street, the weight of his badge no longer resting where it once had, and for the first time in years, he did not look like a man in control of the moment. He looked like a man standing inside it without knowing how to shape it. And though no one turned to him, though no one spoke his name, the absence of expectation was louder than any accusation could have been, because the reckoning he had prepared for had not come, and what stood in its place was something he could not command, could not direct, could not dismiss. Dakota did not wait for acknowledgement, did not seek it, and after a final glance at Elias Whitmore, he turned slightly, just enough for those behind him to see, and without a word, without a signal that anyone outside their line could read, the riders shifted, not all at once, not in unison, but in a quiet understanding that moved through them like wine through grass, and one by one, they began to turn their horses, not away in retreat, not in avoidance, but in completion, as if what they had come to do had already been done the moment they arrived. Before he mounted, Dakota paused, just long enough to lower his head, not deeply, not ceremonially, just enough to mark the moment for what it was, and though the gesture was small, it carried farther than any speech, because it was not given to the town, not given to the law, not given to any man who had watched and said nothing years ago. It was given to one man who had chosen differently, and that difference had outlasted everything else. Elias Whitmore did not respond with grandness, did not step forward, did not raise his hand. He simply stood where he had always stood, steady, unclaimed by the need to be seen or recognized. And as the riders began to move, as the line that had once approached now began to stretch away from the town, the dust lifted again, soft and golden in the morning light, and for a moment, it blurred the edges of everything, the people, the buildings, the space between past and present, until all that remained clear was the direction they were going, not back toward something, but forward, carrying with them what had been returned. The sound of hooves faded slowly, not rushed, not abrupt, just steady, like a heartbeat easing back into its natural rhythm. And when it was gone, when the last of the riders had passed beyond the edge of town and into the open land beyond, Dry Creek remained exactly where it had been, the same buildings, the same streets, the same people, and yet nothing felt the same, because something invisible had shifted, something that could not be rebuilt or undone, something that would remain long after the dust had settled. No one spoke first, not the shopkeeper, not the woman by the well, not even the men who had once stood so certain of their place in the order of things, and eventually, as the moment stretched too long to hold, people began to move again, slow at first, uncertain, like waking from a dream that had felt too real to ignore, and Sheriff Danner turned without a word, walking back toward his office with a gait that had lost something it once carried, not power, not authority, but certainty, the kind that does not return once it has been seen through. Elias remained where he was a moment longer, eyes on the horizon where the riders had disappeared, and then he reached into his coat, out of habit more than need, and found nothing there, no leather pouch, no weight against his chest, and he let his hand rest there for a second, not in loss, not in emptiness, but in understanding, because some things are never meant to be kept, only carried until they find their way home. He turned then, slow and unhurried, and began the walk back to his land at the edge of town, the same path he had taken for years, the same ground beneath his boots, and as he moved, the wind passed through Dry Creek once more, lifting dust into the air, soft and quiet, and if anyone had been listening closely enough, they might have heard it, not in words, not in sound, but in the space between things. A simple truth that did not need to be spoken aloud, that out here, justice does not always arrive with force, sometimes it arrives with memory, and sometimes that is enough.